The Mongol Conquest. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, headed by Genghis Khan and his successors, were one of the most brutal and systematic military campaigns in human history. The Mongols used scorched earth tactics that combined mass slaughter, destruction of infrastructure, and psychological terror to subdue their enemies. One of the most famous examples is the siege of Nishapur in 1221, where Mongol forces slaughtered an estimated 1.7 million population, according to some sources, including women, children, and pets. The Mongols' strength lay not only in their military skills, but also in their use of tactics designed to create extreme fear. A city that surrendered peacefully would usually be allowed to live, but the slightest resistance was met with utter destruction. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 is one of the most horrific examples, where Mongol forces killed hundreds of thousands of residents, destroyed the House of Wisdom, and dumped important books into the Tigris River, causing its water to be said to turn black with ink. These brutal tactics were not just a form of pointless cruelty. By practicing this policy, the Mongols managed to create a domino effect, where many other cities surrendered without a fight, saving time and resources. However, the impact on civilization was devastating, wiping out centers of culture and science. This shows how military strategy can be a tool for world domination, but also destroy the foundations of civilization. The First Crusade. The First Crusade was one of the most brutal events in medieval history, and the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 reflected the peak of that brutality. After a long siege, the Crusaders finally breached the walls of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099. What followed has been described as an indiscriminate massacre of the city's inhabitants, whether Muslims, Jews, or Eastern Christians. Sources such as Fulcher of Chartres' Chronicle and the Gesta Francorum record that blood flowed ankle-deep in the streets of Jerusalem. It is estimated that tens of thousands of residents were killed in a short period of time, including women, children, and the elderly. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which served as a refuge for many residents, turned into a site of mass slaughter. The Crusaders even set fire to a synagogue with many Jews trapped inside. This brutal tactic not only aimed to take control of the city but also sent a message of power and spiritual redemption. In the Crusaders' view, this extreme violence was a form of religious expression to cleanse the Holy Land. However, for the conquered side, it was a nightmare imprinted in the memory of history. The massacre in Jerusalem had a huge impact, sparking deep hatred between the Muslim and Christian worlds. Although this victory was celebrated by the Crusaders, its impact was the beginning of a cycle of revenge that would last for hundreds of years in subsequent conflicts, including the Second Crusade and the Third Crusade. The Albigen Crusade. The Albigen Crusade was one of the wars that best reflected the brutality of medieval tactics. Waged by the Catholic Church to exterminate the Cathars, a Christian sect considered heretical, the war targeted not only soldiers but also civilians. The height of brutality came at the siege of Béziers, 1209, a town that served as a refuge for the Cathars, alongside the coexisting Catholic population. When the Crusaders arrived, Béziers refused to surrender. In a short battle, the city was captured. The Crusaders, under the command of Arnaud Amalric, carried out a massive massacre. When asked how to distinguish between Cathars and Cathars, Amalric allegedly issued the famous order, "Kill them all, God will know his own. Kill them all, God will know his own." As a result, the city's entire population of about 20,000 people was indiscriminately slaughtered, including women, children, and priests. This massacre not only devastated Béziers, but also left a message of terror to other towns in the Languedoc region. This brutal tactic was strategically successful, as many towns surrendered without a fight after hearing of the atrocities in Béziers. Morally and ethically, however, this action was criticized by many, even in Christian circles. The siege of Béziers marked how religious wars in medieval times often transcended the limits of military logic. This indiscriminate violence left lasting historical scars, especially in the south of France, which still remembers this event as a symbol of oppression. The Hite Rebellion. The Hite Rebellion, 1419 to 1434, was one of the most innovative and brutal conflicts in medieval European history. Led by the Hussites, followers of the religious reformer Jan Hus, they fought the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church that sought to suppress the movement. The Hussites, despite being made up of peasants and commoners, managed to hold out against a much larger and well-trained army, thanks to the use of the revolutionary Wagenburg tactic. The Wagenburg tactic involved the use of wooden carts that served as mobile barricades. In battle, these carts were arranged in a defensive circle, creating a temporary, almost impregnable fortress. The Hussites armed these wagons with small cannons, bows, and long spears, allowing them to attack enemy forces from a position of safety. One of the most famous examples of the use of this tactic was the Battle of Sudomnes, 1420, where a small Hussite force crushed a much larger Catholic army. However, the Hussites' success was not only due to tactical innovation. They also applied extreme violence to ensure dominance. In many cases, captured Catholic troops were brutally executed as a message to their enemies. On the other hand, Catholic forces also committed massacres of captured Hussites, including women and children, to suppress rebellion. The Hussite revolt stands out as an example of how military innovation coupled with brutal tactics can change the course of history. Although the rebellion eventually ended in compromise, Wagenburg tactics were widely adopted by other European armies, demonstrating their lasting influence. Battle of Aen Court. The Battle of Aen Court in 1415 was one of the most famous battles in the 100 Years' War between England and France. It reflected the overwhelming success of the smaller English army, led by King Henry V, against the much larger French force. However, this victory was colored by brutal tactics that involved the slaughter of thousands of prisoners of war. After winning the battle, the English forces faced a strategic dilemma. Although they had repulsed the main French army, waves of French reinforcements still threatened. French prisoners of war, numbering in the thousands, including many nobles, posed a potential threat. Henry V ordered the mass execution of the prisoners, even though this violated the chivalric norms of the era. According to chronicles such as the Chronicles of Jean Froissart, the reason for this action was the fear that the prisoners could capitalize on the chaos and strike back from within. These executions were carried out in a brutal manner, including stabbings and beheadings. English soldiers, especially those of common origin, showed hesitation to kill the surrendered nobles, as they were usually a lucrative source of ransom. However, Henry V insisted, and his orders were carried out. This action drew criticism from the French side, and even some English historians. While militarily effective, it reflected the darker side of medieval warfare, where extreme violence was often considered a strategic necessity. The Battle of Aen Court symbolized a great English victory, but the massacre of prisoners left a dark mark on history. Tamerlane's invasions. Timur Lenk, or Tamerlane, one of the most brutal conquerors in medieval history, was known for his military campaigns of systematic terror. In his conquest of the Middle East and Central Asia in the 14th century, Timur used not only military might, but also brutal tactics to instill deep fear in his enemies. One of his signature methods was to create skull towers from the heads of slaughtered enemies. One of the most famous examples is the Siege of Isfahan, 1387. After capturing this prosperous Persian city, Timur initially accepted the population's surrender. However, the minor rebellions that followed led Timur to order a massive massacre. According to chronicles, as many as 70,000 residents were killed, and their heads were collected to build a skull tower as a memorial. The tower was designed to be visible to other cities in the vicinity, forcing them to surrender without a fight. This tactic was not only applied in Isfahan. In other cities such as Aleppo, Baghdad, and Delhi, Timur used extreme violence to ensure dominance. This terror was so effective that many cities surrendered without a fight, preferring to submit rather than face slaughter. The impact of these tactics was immense. While Timur managed to build one of the greatest empires of his time, the brutality of his tactics destroyed many cultural and economic centers. To this day, Timur is remembered not only as a great conqueror, but also a symbol of unbridled violence, leaving a trail of destruction that tarnishes the history of civilization. Siege of Kaffa. The Siege of Kaffa in 1346 is one of the most iconic events in the history of medieval warfare, which was not only brutal, but also extremely senseless with repercussions that went beyond the battlefield. It occurred when Mongol forces from the Golden Khanate, led by Janibeg, laid siege to the port city of Kaffa, present-day Feodosia, Ukraine, an important trading center on the Black Sea controlled by the Genoese colony. During the siege, the Mongol forces suffered setbacks due to an outbreak of a disease suspected to be the Black Death, Yersinia pestis. In a last-ditch effort to crush their enemy, the Mongols employed a brutal and unusual biological tactic. They threw infected corpses into the city using slingshots. The aim was to spread the plague among the city's defenders. According to Italian notary Gabriele de Musi, who documented these events, the tactic succeeded in creating chaos within Kaffa, forcing many residents to flee in their ships. Ironically, this action also led to the spread of plague to Europe through the ports connected to Kaffa, triggering one of the deadliest pandemics in history, which killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe in less than a decade. The Siege of Kaffa was an early example of the use of biological weapons, albeit unintentionally on a global scale. This event shows how the brutality of medieval warfare not only impacted the battlefield, but also affected the course of human history as a whole, with unforeseen consequences. The Conquest of England. After William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he faced stiff resistance from the inhabitants of northern England who refused to submit to Norman rule. To quell this rebellion, William decided to use a tactic that was not only brutal, but also economically and socially devastating, known as the Harrying of the North, 1070 to 1071. This strategy involved the systematic destruction of villages, burning of fields, and culling of livestock in the northern regions of England, especially in Yorkshire and Northumbria. William's troops leveled settlements, killed thousands of inhabitants, and starved thousands more. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that not a village was left standing, and that the land became like a wilderness. William even ordered the indiscriminate killing of civilians, including women and children, to ensure no more rebellions. This tactic resulted in total destruction for the region. Sources from the 12th century, such as the Orderic Vitalis, record that thousands died of starvation, and most farmland remained unproductive for years afterward. A survey in the Domesday Book in 1086 showed that many villages in the region were still empty 2 decades later. The Harrying of the North is considered one of the most brutal acts in medieval English history. Although William managed to secure his power, his policies left deep wounds on the people of northern England, which did not fully recover until centuries later. This strategy also reflects the dark side of conquest, where political goals are often achieved through inhumane violence. Siege of Acre. The Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, was one of the major battles of the Third Crusade, in which Crusader forces, led by Richard the Lionheart, captured the strategic port city of Acre from Muslim rule. Although this victory was a great achievement for the Crusaders, the events that followed were characterized by brutal acts that tarnished Richard's name. After the city surrendered on July 12, 1191, Crusader forces captured around 2,700 Muslim captives, including women and children. Richard hoped to use these captives as bargaining chips to obtain ransom money, weapons, and holy relics from Saladin, the legendary Muslim leader. However, negotiations were slow, and tensions rose due to fears that Muslim forces around Acre would attack again. On August 20th, 1191, Richard decided to execute the entire captive. In full view of the Muslim troops on guard, the captives were taken out of the city and systematically massacred, including women and children. Chronicles from both sides, including Baha ad-Din, a Muslim historian, and Regis Riccardi's Itinerarium, a Crusader chronicle, record that blood flowed freely, while the Crusaders dumped the bodies into a large ditch. The execution was a brutal act that reflected the strategic and political pressures Richard faced. While effective at asserting Crusader power and intimidating Saladin, it also reinforced hatred between the Christian and Muslim worlds. prolonging conflict and revenge for decades to come. The siege of Acre became a symbol of bloody victory, showing the darkest side of religious wars in medieval times. The Scottish War. In the late 13th century, Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, sought to subdue Scotland through a brutal war characterized by indiscriminate violence. After defeating several major rebellions, Edward used terror tactics to solidify his control, with one of the most blatant acts being the execution of William Wallace, a legendary Scottish rebellious figure. After his arrest in 1305, Wallace was tried in London on charges of treason, even though he had never sworn allegiance to the King of England. His sentence reflected the brutality of the era. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a notoriously brutal method of execution. Wallace was first hanged until almost dead, then his body was opened while still alive, his entrails were removed, and finally his body was cut into 4 pieces. Wallace's head was mounted on the top of London Bridge, while his body parts were sent to various cities in England to warn other rebels. In addition to Wallace's execution, Edward I also destroyed Scottish villages, burned fields, and seized crops, forcing the population into submission through starvation and economic ruin. This strategy aimed to quell the rebellion by breaking the spirit of the Scottish people. However, Edward's brutal tactics only strengthened the resolve of the Scots. In the years following his death, resistance continued under new leaders such as Robert the Bruce, who eventually secured Scottish independence. These Scottish wars reflect the irony of history. While terror and violence can temporarily subdue, it often plants the seeds of greater resistance.